Welcome Exiles to my in-stacking Deadeye. Have you, or a loved one you know, ever received insults such as dumb, stupid, or idiot? Haters exist everywhere, waiting around the corner for the perfect moment to strike with one of these deadly verbal attacks. It's time we fight back, by going back to the basics, stack knowledge, learning, and wisdom. While these haters study the blade, we seek transcendence to a greater plane of existence through our mental prowess. By speccing ourselves entirely into intelligence, we have gained the power to vaporize our opponents in battle via laser beams we can now conjure from our minds. Through the conduit of a small twig we pick up off the ground. All foes will beg for mercy, seeing our giga brain blot out the color of the sun with its sheer size and girth. Join the In-Stacking Alliance, where the only concern in life is whether or not our heads will explode from trying to contain so much knowledge. This character is built around the Key Shaper / Hunter Wand mod that grants 1 to 6 lightning damage per 10 intelligence. With this essential building block combined with other key features like the fact intelligence also scales % energy shield, we have the necessary components to scale both our effective health pool and our baseline damage via the intelligence stat. This works wonderfully in combination with wand skills such as Power Siphon, which is a tremendous single target skill when combined with barrage support due to its many additional projectiles innately provided by the skill gem. And we take this innately strong scaling even further using Vengeance Cascade to double our hits. We can get with each attack effectively doubling our damage. I would recommend watching the video I made using this mechanic if you're curious about it, as I covered it in greater detail there. We then grab Kinetic Blast, another wanding skill which to me feels like potentially the best clearing skill in the game, for our clear setup, to vaporize map monsters' screens away with ease. All in all, the build leads to a fairly simple playstyle of shield charging and flame dashing around for our movement, using Kinetic Blast to clear packs of monsters, and then unleashing a death barrage of Power Siphon on any tankier monster that dares to look in our general direction thinking they can survive. The build mostly just features a medium amount of defense, I would say, in having blind, phase acrobatics, 4 to 5 from shield charge, 6k plus energy shield, unaffected by curses, and a decent amount of energy shield leech. Additionally, you can end up getting a lot of energy shield gained on hit once you acquire an ES on hit Watcher's Eye mod. Now this isn't top of the line defense, but I end up deeming it acceptable because it features my second favorite layer of defense. Good offense. We kill most of our enemies before they can so much as breathe threateningly in our general direction. We convert half our lightning damage to cold via Call of the Brotherhood, and combine that with Blast Freeze to constantly freeze all monsters within our general vicinity to make map clear feel quite safe, along with some fairly sizable chills on map bosses of about 20%. This ring choice may lose a small bit of damage, but the quality of life feels way too good to pass up. It also allows us to use Trinity support, which in the end makes the damage loss not so large, and my one qualm with Trinity support is for the first second of dealing damage to a boss, we're not at full strength while waiting for the resonance to tick to full, but again, I would say the quality of life of chilling the bosses and freezing map monsters still makes up for this. Now let me say here and now, I do not recommend this build as a league starter. Granted, I have showcased it can be strong on a shoestring budget, but it has a very poor leveling experience. In-stackers are gear dependent, and even on twink leveling gear, it isn't the greatest leveling experience, because the mandatory flat lightning damage print mod this build is based around requires a level 60 plus character to even equip, which means for the first 60 levels you're going to have a bad time and need to level as a different build like Hollow Palm in respect to an instacker, along with the fact the wand mod is restricted to Shaper and Hunter wands. This also means the wands won't be very available on a fresh league start for the first couple days. I fully can recommend it as a second build of the league, but I thought I should include this disclaimer in the video as I have seen a lot of comments from people about doing it on a league start, which I believe would be a painful experience, and I want to advise against it. Now before going in game, I want to quickly go over the POB. I did include leveling trees with this character, all the way from 94 all the way down to 10, but I do not recommend leveling as an instacker because the instacking mod from the wand isn't available until you're like level 60 plus for a wand to have it. So in the notes section, if you go over here, I include advice on other options for leveling, things that I would recommend doing that'll make your experience not a painful time, because leveling in Stacker I don't particularly recommend. Now, specifically talking about the POB, the notes section here, I put a lot of work into this, trying to color code stuff to give you a good idea of where specific information is, and I'm going to just quickly go over each section and explain what they are. Leveling, self-explanatory, I'm just giving advice for alternate leveling routes besides an in-stacker, because leveling is just bad until you get to level 60 and you get to equip the wand. Other things I have are important for playing the build successfully. These are things like, if you get this wrong, you're going to have a bad time, and that's Hydrosphere positioning, far shot. Definitely read over that. I'm going to show some examples in-game after the POB section. Gem links, pretty self-explanatory there. Thresholds for success. This is something where if you're playing the build, you feel like you're copying it one for one, but something just isn't working. It feels like it sucks. Check these out, because certain things can make the difference in the build working versus not working. For example, accuracy. If you somehow manage to not get any accuracy in your gear, say you end up with a 50% chance to hit, that's the difference in dealing like 70% less damage. Say you had everything else right, but you forgot to grab accuracy on a few pieces of gear, that's the difference in your build dealing a fourth of the damage type of scenario. So definitely check your thresholds for success. These are the main ones I thought of, and I might add more as time goes on. I'll update the POB if I think of some more obvious things you want to make sure you have right. Misinformation, frequently asked questions. This is pretty much just random information that I don't want to make an entire section out of, / questions I get asked a lot. I'll probably be adding to this as I get questions in the comments for commonly asked questions or things I forgot to mention previously while writing this out. Where to put currency first. This is my guideline to follow if you're trying to figure out, okay, I have this amount of currency, where do I put it? What upgrades do I make? What things do I buy first? Stuff like that. That is what you want to look at here if you're trying to figure out where you're going to invest some things first. I have a section basically going over some basic crafting terminology. If you're new to crafting, you don't understand, if I use some terms that don't make sense, because I go over how to craft pretty much every slot of gear. If I use terms that don't make sense to you or you haven't seen them before, check here. I maybe have explained it here. If there's terms I don't explain, maybe let me know in the comments and I'll try to add that to this section as well, so there's stuff's more self-explanatory. Cluster jewels, wand. This is pretty much me just going over every single gear piece that you can craft, how to craft them, whether I'd recommend crafting them or buying them, stuff like that. And I go over the budget version, kind of the mid-level budget, and then the expensive version. And then I also tell you, hey, the video you just watched, this is the level of gear I showcase in the video. So for the cluster jewels, for example, the character showcase, kind of the mid-budget level of clusters is what I had, and then I bought these crit mediums, this ailment mediums, and I go over that for every single piece. I go over the expense level and the gear I have in the video, stuff like that, just to give you a good idea of where the character falls. Also, important things I try to include is expected cost of crafts. So for example, in the helmet section, I have the high budget craft estimate for the helmet is between 4 and 12x. Now, when I go over these estimates, it's all based around the things that are variable. Like for example, I don't know how expensive a +2 projectile hubris power siphon enchant's going to be. A couple days ago or a week ago, it might have been super cheap. I don't know. The market seems super volatile. I'm not sure where this is going to land. Maybe next league it'll be cheap, stuff like that. You'll see 1 to 9x. That's a huge variance right there. That's pretty much the majority of the variance in this craft cost. If you can get the helmet base for 1x, you're going to be a lot closer to 4x on the estimate of this craft cost. So try to look at the exact money you're spending on the higher variable items. Like say there's bases that could vary in between a wide range of prices. If you know you can get it for X amount of price, that could give you a better idea of what you're going to end up on in terms of the crafting cost. There's other things like when I go to the high budget this or that, there's scenarios where you could end up doing multiple prefixes can't be changed, multiple suffixes can't be changed, multiple harvest crafts, stuff like that can start blowing the budget just out of proportion. So you'll see on the high budget stuff, it's like at a minimum, you know, if you hit the stuff on the first try, you're going to be at 7x. But then there's also the scenario where you miss a bunch of a very important expensive step. Like for me, in the boot craft, I missed the Ashling 50/50 when trying to upgrade to the high budget craft. I missed it 7 times in a row, and that ended up wasting 30x with not giving me a visible upgrade. That's super unlucky, and that's just how crafting can go sometimes. So when you're considering going from a mid-budget level to one of the higher budget level items, definitely consider to look at how much I estimate if the price can blow up. Definitely check these to give a good idea. Do I really want to go for the high budget craft? Is it worth it to me? Stuff like that's something you should consider. For the most part, a lot of the gear you can keep within a pretty stable, reasonable price range. It's mostly just blows up when you go for the high budget crafts, I would say. There are some high budget crafts that I definitely would recommend doing. For example, the wand. I recommend this in the gear priority section here. I say this is definitely one you want to go for. Wand makes a huge difference in how much damage you're dealing, and the high budget wand, although it could go up to 16x, it's most likely going to be more around the 8, 9, 10x range, most reasonably, and 16x really isn't that crazy compared to some of the other high budget items, which can go skyrocket much higher in prices. This is relatively reasonably contained, and it gives you a lot of value for the investment. Stuff like that, I would consider. Anyways, I spent a whole lot of time basically going over all the different gear pieces and stuff. That's the majority of the notes section, because gearing is the biggest part of an instacker. Instackers are all about the gear. It's all about crafting the gear, getting good items, and that's kind of what makes the build. You can copy the tree one for one pretty easily, but it comes down to the nitty gritty of how do I craft each item, how do I make that stuff. So I try to spend a lot of time doing that. And other things I'm considering doing, this was kind of something I've had a change of perspective on. With the Righteous Fire build I made, a lot of people really like the effort I put into the POB, the notes section, writing that stuff out, putting that work in. And I think this is something I want to continue doing more in builds. I want to kind of elevate my guides. I want to be better at making guides, something that can help people where they can pull up the notes section. They don't have to rewatch the video, and they can skip right to the portion. They know the notes are there. They know the information's there. Stuff like that I want to try to get better at. And I'm going to do this going forward. Whenever I make a fully fleshed out guide, this is something that I want you guys to be able to expect from me when I make my guides. Along with that, I'm also considering adding in a section that says, hey, these are updates for the next patch. This is how the builds change. Stuff like that I'm going to consider doing for this character and potentially the Righteous Fire character. And going forward, when I do the full in-depth guide with all this sorts of extra information, I will then be looking at, say, the patch notes, and I'll go back and say, what changed for this build? Are there any obvious improvements or changes I can make to the build? And I'll give you an idea. I think I'll write up a section that'll be like 3.16, 3.17, updates to the build, stuff like that. And you can always check that section in the future if you're watching this in a future patch or a later patch. And that section should hopefully give you a good idea of, hey, does this build still work? Is this build broken? Did this build get buffed? Did it get nerfed? That sort of information is something I would like to cover there to give you a good idea if you're using this in a future patch. Will it work? Will it won't work? Stuff like that. Anyways, that's the summary on the POB section. Hopefully you guys appreciate that. Let's go in game, and I'm going to talk kind of about the bigger picture stuff of the build, how the build works, things like that, and let's get to it. Alright, now that we're in game, I kind of want to go over some of the bigger picture things about the build. To start off with, one of the cool things that I thought was neat, and I will include this in the future whenever I do a Spellslinger setup with Hydrosphere, is Anomalous Onslaught support. It's just a 10% multiplier on the 25% reservation of Hydrosphere, or Spellslinger, so it's really not too bad in terms of reservation, and it adds an extra little, hey, you get Onslaught in the build while fighting bosses now, and occasionally in a map if you finish them off with Hydrosphere. I thought, man, that's a great little addition. I liked that. Other things I liked were going with Call the Brotherhood instead of another like in-stacking ring. This ring, it's probably a little less damage because we lose out on some int, we lose out on some damage scaling, but the big thing we get is we can now freeze monsters. This in combination with the Cluster Jewel Blast Freeze over here, I feel is such a feels-good safety thing. When I switched this out while mapping, or while I started mapping with it, it felt so much safer to map because everything would be frozen around us and we could just keep clearing the screens. It worked great, and then you get the shattering. Monster shattering is just so much more satisfying than the sound of killing enemies that aren't frozen, so definitely would recommend just because it feels good. It's a nice quality of life. I think this is a great addition to mix in with Instackers. I really liked it. Other big things we did, of course, are Vengeance Cascade. Check out the video I did on this explaining how it works, and I just realized I did the whole showcase of this build, and I didn't bless the amulet to 15%, which is the difference in it being 18% intelligence and 16. Anyway, but don't look at the amulet, okay? That's not the point. Anyways, it's Zuri's Reflection. Feels great for curse immunity. You can roll, or curse unaffected by. You can roll whatever map mods you want, pretty much. The only map mods we care about are really just Ellie Reflect, Fizz Reflect. Feels great. Can recommend. Don't care about temporal change. Just a good feeling. Other things that potentially, if you're min-maxing this build, the high budget pair of boots would give you freeze immunity, which would allow you to drop our auto freeze removal flask for something like a Bottled Faith, which in turn would allow you to drop some crit on the tree for some other damage notes. There's some sizable upgrades you can still make to this character. Things I did like as well were breathstealer. I consider this kind of a DPS option. Because Vengeance Cascade is so good, it's even better than Tranquility, which is a really good damage option. So this is a way to get Tranquility still into the build, still get some really good damage out of it, but it's at the cost of about 1,000 ES. It depends how good of rare gloves you can get. But I'd say this is a great option if you want to go for DPS. If you want to go for more survivability, then go for a rare pair of gloves. But I think, it's a great option to have, basically like a DPS option and a more well-rounded option. And then eventually, if you want to go for 100% Delirious content, look into crafting multi-link gloves. I think that'll take it to the next level where it can do Delirious content pretty comfortably and pretty efficiently. Other things I would say is, while you're looking at things to craft for the high budget, I recommend this in the guide 100%. Wand is one of the most instrumental items to get a good version of. I definitely recommend the first high budget item you're going to do is probably going to be the wand because of how much damage it gives you to have a decent crafted one of these. 100% recommend that. Okay. That's my brief overview of the gear. Looking at the flasks, I have a bleed removal mana flask. This is just, I include this in pretty much every flask just because it makes bleed not an issue. And on top of that, it helps solve whatever lingering mana issues we might have. We don't really have mana issues because we get leech from our Fuel the Fight notable, so it's not too big of a deal, but I do like to use Enduring Mana Flask to spam my Kinetic Blast before a boss spawns to stack up Tailwind. Feels good. I also have two flasks where I basically switch them to keys where I can't press them with Auto Remove Shock, Auto Remove Freeze. As I said before, you could take out the Freeze Removal Flask once you get the higher budget version of the shoes. We have a Diamond Flask with increased crit craft. I would get this with either max charges, reduced charges, increased duration, something like that, so you can get some good uptime on this flask while fighting bosses. I have the use when you hit a rare monster. This basically just makes it so I just don't have to worry about pressing it at the appropriate times because it'll always trigger when I'm fighting a unique monster, always trigger when I'm fighting a unique boss. It maybe waste charges occasionally, but for the most part, I think it's just another button I don't have to press while mapping. Feels great to not have to press buttons. And then Quicksilver, because movement speed, you can't play a build without Quicksilver. It just feels wrong. So yeah, that's the Flasks Setup. When we're looking at our skill gems, I do want to highlight one thing. I'm using Inspiration Support. I started switching to Inspiration Support when I used the lower budget version of the build and I forgot to switch back to Elemental Damage with attacks. This is pretty much a scenario where the more int you get, the higher your mana pool goes, and eventually you'll pick up Prodigal Perfection, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, which gives you a bit more mana scaling, which means your mana pool that's unreserved will begin getting higher and higher, which makes it so you can end up going for Elemental Damage with attacks instead of Inspiration Support, which is about 10% more damage. But play this on feels. Like, if it feels like you're running out of mana, switch out of Elemental Damage with attacks, use Inspiration Support, and kind of play it off that is what I'd recommend there. I probably can afford to go for Elemental Damage with attacks with the unreserved 150 mana. We're probably at that stage where we don't need this, but just something to keep in mind, as well as you can end up going for minus mana cost on your one ring here, which could make the mana issues worth swapping from Inspiration to Elemental Damage with attacks. I believe that covers the flasks, the main gem things we got going on. One thing I really want to cover is playstyle of the build. I mentioned this as important things to do right for playing the build successfully in the notes section, which is Hydrosphere. The placement of Hydrosphere can make or break your DPS. Say Danig here was an enemy, and I was trying to hit him. If I place my Hydrosphere in front of the enemy, you see no projectiles are getting to him. None of them. None of them were getting no hits, 0 damage. If this is the case, where you spawn the Hydrosphere in front of the boss, you immediately want to start attacking way far away to get the Hydrosphere to move. If you're attacking just pretty close to the Hydrosphere, it won't reposition until you get far enough away with your mouse. So always make sure when you're placing the Hydrosphere, it either needs to be directly on top of the boss or behind the boss. Now, it's hard to do because Danig isn't an enemy, but when you hover the mouse over the enemy, it will auto put the Hydrosphere directly on top of the boss. You'll get used to it. It feels fine when you've actually played with it a little bit. Initially though, it's going to be a little bit awkward.
basically what I do is if I end up having a bad placement, I usually just flame dash somewhere else, and then it's an easy reposition. That's normally my playstyle for it. And also, besides Hydrosphere positioning, there is also your positioning in reference to how far away the boss is. Because we are a Deadeye, we are using the Far Shot Notable, and if we're close to the enemy, we deal 20% less damage, whereas if we're far from the enemy, we deal 60% more damage. It's pretty much the damage in dealing, the difference in being close versus far away is the difference in dealing like double the damage. So ideally you want to be, I don't know, roughly about, I'd say this far away from the boss. That's about 70 units right there. 70 units is the maximum distance you need to be for Far Shot to deal maximum DPS. So generally when you're positioning from a boss, try to be about this far away, roughly, or a little bit farther. Farther away never hurts your DPS. It only hurts if you get too far away and then you put the Hydrosphere in front of the boss type of thing. But for the most part, just try to keep the boss on sort of like the edge of your screen-ish type of deal, and that will always mean you're getting maximum damage out of Far Shot. So that should cover the basics of the main things that are important about the build. Hopefully the POB gives you a good idea of how to make the gear, how to prioritize gearing, all that sorts of stuff. This character, I'm really happy with it. It worked on the high end to a great extent, and it worked on the lower end as well. That's why I ended up wanting to do a full fleshed out build guide on this, because it was such a good character from both a low investment perspective all the way to the high investment. It was successful early, and it just felt really good to upgrade. For example, like each time I was switching between the budgets of the various characters I put together, there's a very noticeable big, like, feels good difference in the gear upgrades from going from 3x to 14x, from going from 14x all the way to the 50x character I have here. So anyways, I'm really happy with this build. Hopefully you guys like it too. Hopefully the guide information I put out is useful. I will be trying to update that if there's things I missed, if there's mistakes I made, stuff like that. I will put in the comments. I'll say updated POB, this thing I added, etc. And then in the future, I'm going to try to be updating the POB with information about this thing got nerfed, this thing got buffed, this build still works, this build doesn't work, stuff like that. I'll add a section into POB for that. That being said, this is kind of the last big project I wanted to do for this league. Right now we're getting within we're less than a month away from my wife giving birth, and that is going to be a big change for us. We have one baby, it's going to be two babies, it's going to be a lot more stress, and along with that, we're going to be moving, we're going to be selling this house. There's a lot of life changes for me coming up, and most likely, I believe it means I'm not going to be playing next league, or I'm not really going to be making much content for next league. Just a heads up on that. We'll see how that stuff all pans out. I'll try to keep people updated maybe on the Discord sort of things, like, hey, this is where we're at, stuff like that. I most likely will be, after the move, getting a more normal full-time job, and my wife will be with the babies at home, and that'll mean I might only just end up streaming on the weekends occasionally, and I will probably be making less YouTube content, but that, I don't know, we'll figure it out as we go. Just wanted to give you guys a kind of a notification or heads up on that. That's what's going on with me. If you see my YouTube content and you're like, man, Captain Lance hasn't updated or uploaded for like 2 months or 3 months or whatever it is, that's why. I'm not dead or anything like that. I'm perfectly well. We're just going through a big transition in our lives with a new baby, moving, selling the house, stuff like that. So anyways, hopefully, as always, you guys enjoyed the video, and I will catch you all later. Have an excellent rest of your days. Peace out, guys.